current political disaster can trace its lineage right back to Jimmy Carter, where we have failed Democratic presidents who make promises, don't deliver, and then we have this pattern where we get an even worse Republican.
Which side are you on?
Chris Townsend is a longtime union member. He has been the organizing director and political director for UE, as well as organizing director for the Amalgamated Transit Union. Chris Townsend, welcome to the program. Thanks again for taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We wanted to talk to you about Jimmy Carter. You were a union worker when Jimmy Carter was president. You wrote a piece in Jacobin magazine titled something like, and forgive me, I'm going to pull it up now, but it was something like Jimmy Carter was no friend to union workers like me, something like that. And so we're going to talk about his track record as president and walk through some of these things that you mentioned in your article. But I guess the first thing is, and I am sort of glad that we were off last weekend so that we could talk to you now, because I think, at this point, people have basically calmed down. I think that the 4th was 1 or 2 days after he had died. And I don't know that I would have wanted to have the Jimmy Carter bashing session 1 day after he died, but a week after he died, I think I'm fine with. But let's just remind people, I think it's important to remind people why is it important that we go through this exercise of reminding people that he was bad. He was really bad. He wasn't just the really nice guy who built houses for poor people. He wasn't even just the guy who was going around on Democracy Now! Talking about how Israel is an apartheid state in 2002, which was, honorable. And all of his post-presidential record really was kind of trying to, it seems like, doing work to kind of undo some of the bad stuff that he did while he was president. So why is it important that we don't just remember him as the nice old man who built houses, which he was, right? That was part of Jimmy Carter, but why can't we only remember that part?
Yeah, thank you to both of you. And I'm going to start indulging myself. I got my thank you letter for helping to kick in some support for the Valley Labor Report. So everybody listening and then watching, this doesn't happen out of thin air. And it's important that you guys cover this, because we've just finished the funeral of Carter after 2 years in hospice and 100 years old. I mean, certainly some milestones there. And probably everyone in the country saw some piece of that coverage. And I would submit that the coverage was in large measure factual, but it was a sin of omission. It didn't talk about any of the things that I'm going to talk about. And I suppose at funerals, that's the privilege of the families there. We're not trying to heap scorn on the guy, even when he deserves it. But he's passed from the scene now. And I guess I'll go back and say that when I heard that he was going into hospice, that's when I wrote this article. So this is a 2-year-old article. And you got the title right. It's on Jacobin. You can Google it up, or you can find it on my Facebook page. If you find Chris Townsend's Facebook, I've got it up there. It's been very, very popular worldwide, actually, which kind of surprised me. But I think there is and there has been a real suspicion about his record. Was it really all peaches and cream? Was it all building houses for homeless? Was it all speaking up on occasion for the Palestinian people? Was it all those things? Well, it was, but there is a very dark and unbelievably destructive side of Carter when he was president. And in the article, I sort of detail this. It's a very brief article. I wrote it as an obituary from a worker. I'm not a college professor. I don't write books and all this. I mean, most of our liberal left media chock full of these folks. I was just a regular blue collar worker in high school and then work when Carter was president. And I started the article by sort of commenting that there was a great relief when he was elected in 1976. Remember, we had gone through the debacle of Watergate and the collapse of the economy, pretty much the oil shocks, the energy shocks, and all this, and the beginnings of deindustrialization. And people were scrambled. Things that they never thought were going to fall apart and disintegrate were falling apart and disintegrating in front of their eyes. Here comes Jimmy Carter, the man from Plains, Georgia. Well, you had to root for him in a way because he came from a non-traditional background in terms of running for president, and he had an interesting family. His mom was still alive, and they had Rosalind, his wife, and him had a young daughter. He had his sort of on again, off again drunken brother, Billy. And, let's not forget that the establishment media and both political parties worked very hard to destroy him, to keep him from ever, going anywhere in terms of this. And they failed. And I think that was the longing of the American people, much like we have today, for a president who's authentic, honest, recognizes the reality of their situation, their declining situation. And anyway, this all ended up with Jimmy Carter being elected in 1976. And anyone who ever watches any of the old videos, the most remarkable thing that happened, and you'd have to remember this was a big deal in the country in 1976 when their limousine was bringing them down, I believe, Pennsylvania Avenue to the inauguration. They got out and walked. Rosalind, Jimmy, and their daughter Amy, and they walked. I mean, this was just unheard of. We didn't have an emperor who was being elected. We had a more common man. So hopes were high. Well, I was young. I was still in high school at that time, and I was thinking, well, maybe this, couldn't get any worse than Nixon. All of that and the collapse of the economy. At that point in time, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do to make a living. When I got out of high school, I wasn't college bound. So in any case, Carter begins his governance in 1977. Well, it didn't take long for working people, the labor movement, liberals, the left, to realize that this guy was essentially declaring an end to the legacy of the New Deal. And he didn't verbalize it as clearly as that. But his first several years in office were characterized by some of the most anti-worker, anti-labor actions that you could imagine. He did fancy himself, and the label was affixed to him. He was the original so-called New Democrat, which we then later, especially under Carter, came to realize was a label for a very bitterly anti-union, anti-worker, pro-corporate Democrat. So this is where Carter came from. This was sort of this tricky political alchemy that they thought was going to save the Democratic Party. So in no particular order, he became a fanatic proponent of deregulation. He led his congressional majority of Democrats to deregulate trucking, deregulate the railroads, deregulate the airlines. Well, none of those industries, so far as workers are concerned, or the employees in them, have ever recovered. I'll use trucking as the example. Everybody probably knows somebody driving a truck. You used to drive a truck. There's high probability you were in the Teamsters Union. You had benefits and a pension. You had limited hours, and you could make a living. Well, today, you'll run into these poor truck drivers going cross country, working for nothing, having to own the rig. I mean, this is an industry that was systematically deregulated and therefore reduced from a living wage industry to abject poverty and hell on wheels. And rail, likewise. The railroad industry has never recovered. The workers now, I'm speaking about the workers. Of course, corporate profits in all three of those industries are through the roof. So Carter served those industries very, very well. And the labor movement at that time was sort of dumbstruck by this because they had sort of naturally expected, I'm speaking of the labor leadership in 1977, 78, they sort of expected Carter to perform according to his expected promises, sort of like, we're going to get in there and we're going to promulgate labor law reform. We're going and I should say for listeners and viewers, eventually, all of these problems that I'm referencing were only a tiny scale compared to what we have today. We have all of these same problems today, a thousandfold magnified over the 40, 45 years, but it was still a shock to us at that time. So Carter had led everyone to believe he was going to support labor law reform, meaning he was going to make it legal and possible again in a significant way to join a union and organize a union, push back. Well, he abandoned that because it became inflationary. He was dealing with inflation. He had inherited, massive deficit spending from Nixon and Ford and the endless war in Vietnam, billions and billions blown on that. And in any case, as most Democrats are prone to do, the sacrifice was not equal. Uh, Prices were only marginally limited and wages were suppressed in Carter's effort to push that down. So this, of course, aggravated people. I remember as a kid, you could go to the store week to week and see the prices of things going up. Nothing rattles people like that. We just saw in the recent election the impact of inflationary processes on the way people think. He also abandoned the building trades union. There was some legislation that back then was known as the Common Situs Picketing Bill. This would have allowed and continued to allow the building trades to go out and picket non-union sites, work sites, and continue to organize and be a factor. Well, that was banned, and anyone listening who's in the construction industry, and you're now stuck with the two-gate system where if there is a union contractor, it has to go through this gate, another gate. Well, this was the result of Carter, so that now the building trades have really been cowed and reduced in size and influence. Residential work on the building trades has been lost. So we can thank Jimmy Carter and his abandonment of the Common Situs Picketing Bill for that. So in any case, rounding out and I'm summarizing, of course, but rounding out the Jimmy Carter resume was his unbelievably catastrophic foreign policy, which of course does impact domestic policies and the domestic situation. He picked up where Nixon and Ford left off, propping up the Shah of Iran, a medieval character, torturer, repressor. And then Carter, I guess, thought he was doing him a favor and allowed the Shah to come into the United States after he had been unceremoniously overthrown. And Carter allowed him to come in to seek treatment for his cancer. What it was really doing was to harbor him from, numerous countries that would have gladly returned him to Iran for trial. Well, in any case, this is what led to the outpouring of anger and the seizure of our embassy and the so-called hostages thing, which then was the last year of his presidency, and he never could escape from this. I mean, he looked perpetually weak and confused on this situation. And of course, all through that process, we had great uncertainty about gas, gasoline, oil imports, and all this, Iran having been a big producer of oil. So this debacle that Carter had in the entire year of his regime was also really just a continuation of his other things. There wasn't a single war around the world that the United States was waging, either overtly or covertly, that he didn't support. You could see that Carter was incredibly worried when he was president of somehow being defined as weak on communism, weak on the Soviet Union. This was a pathology. Carter shared it. As history will be written, he empowered the so-called intelligence agencies that we have. We have 16 of them now, if you can believe this, practically $1 trillion budget by themselves, if we could ever get to the bottom of it. But these forces engaged in military conflicts all over the world on multiple continents with his support. And I'll mention, probably without going into it too much, because I know time is short, but we can thank Jimmy Carter directly for the creation and inflaming of the fundamentalist, fanatic, Islamic terror wing. It was fomented and created by Carter's White House Zbigniew Brzezinski, who I believe his daughter now is on one of the MSNBC shows, Micah Brzezinski. Her father, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was the right-hand man of Jimmy Carter. When Jimmy got up in the morning, he talked to Zabig. And Zabig was a pathologically anti-communist lunatic, a certifiable lunatic, and engaged in all these worldwide debacles. And I'm going to quote one thing, and then I'll end on this, because people, this is all glossed over. Nobody got up at the funeral and talked about any of this, as you might imagine. But everybody listening understands how this so-called war on terror and all of this impacts every facet of our life today. Well, this was the question where it was from John Cooley's book. John Cooley authored a book called Unholy Wars, and he wrote a great documentary history of how did this really happen? How did the Carter administration begin to actually support these lunatic, murderous elements? Well, it was because, how it is here, Cooley revealed in his book how the U.S. actually worked to encourage a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, an anti-communist fanatic, admitted in 1998 that the secret reality is that on July 3rd, 1979, President Carter signed the first directive for clandestine aid to the enemies of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. That was the early bin Laden forces and all of the other forces. Brzezinski admitted further that on that day, I wrote a note to Carter, President Carter, in which I explained that this aid to these Islamic fundamentalists would result in military intervention by the Soviets. We didn't push the Soviets to start the war, the invasion, but we consciously increased the probability that they would do so. So, yeah, of course, somebody should have gotten up at the funeral of Jimmy Carter and say, Jimmy, you are responsible for this pathology that you have unleashed and strengthened around the world, which we still grapple with today. And it's breaking us financially, morally, militarily, and everything else. So I end with, or I wrap up, and I'll take a question or two. This regime of his was a catastrophe. Here I was a young worker, and I guess I do know more now after 45 years than I did when I was a young worker. But facts are stubborn things. And this man's regime, rather than being the post-Nixon regime that might have revived the New Deal, helped revive the labor movement, strengthen the internal economy and whatnot, no. It took a right turn into war and pestilence and debt. And then ultimately, as I say in my article, I'll quote my own article, but you can look it up. It's short. I said, for me, a young blue-collar worker, the hellish years of Ronald Reagan, for me, started when Carter was elected. And so it was seamless. And there was no doubt in the final year of Carter's regime that he was done, that Ronald Reagan was going to defeat him overwhelmingly because of this chosen course of governance that he had selected. And here we are today. I think actually I'll say that we can, when the history is written, if it's written based on facts and not on press releases, that the current political disaster that we are subjected to can trace its lineage right back to Jimmy Carter, where we have failed Democratic presidents who get elected, raise expectations, make promises, don't deliver, avoid delivering when it comes to working people. And then we have this pattern where we get an even worse Republican elected in reaction. I mean, this becomes the whole story of Carter, Clinton, Obama, and now old Joe Biden has bequeathed us almost directly whatever the Trump 2 regime will be. So I guess I did say in my article that I wouldn't have minded having Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter as my next door neighbors. They were nice people. But boy, we better not forget the facts here. And if we do, as working people here in the United States, we will go through this again and again.
Right.
We must examine this.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
I'm curious what you think, like, because it seems like, you mentioned there was a lot of hope around his inauguration. And so in a lot of ways, it seems like there is kind of a through line in his pre-presidency and his post-presidency. Like, there's a lot of consistency insofar as, like, he seems like genuinely somebody that wants to try to maybe make the world better and do things for people. And then it's as if his presidency is an aberration and, like, something possesses him. And what was it you think that that kind am I maybe
Sure.
not understanding the history correctly with respect to his pre-presidency, or does that basically sound right? And, like, what do you make of that? How is it that happened?
I think it's quite clear. It should be quite clear that Carter's post-presidency, all of his so-called good works, the things that he did that were all repeated and much of it correctly in his funeral, and the sum ups that were written and spoken about him. I think all of this sprang directly from his recognition of this catastrophe that he had gotten involved in as a president. I don't think he was a stupid man. I think he was quite perceptive in many ways, and I think that for a variety of reasons, he would know better than me, right? Or when he was alive, he would have known better than me. The sordid depths of things that he, was pulled into or jumped into and took the country. You've got to presume that a president thinks that that's the right thing to do at the time. But it was so obviously setting the stage for the next stage of worse. A good example of this, guys, the opening of China. The opening of China from the United States, or what gets referred to as the opening of China, was solely. There was no other basis for it other than trying to utilize that relationship in order to try to wreck the Soviet Union. It was a big power gamesmanship. But quickly, even in the early years, or the later years rather, with Carter, and certainly under Reagan, this is what set in motion this understanding by the U.S. government and the corporate forces that was just people, they were salivating. We can move to China. We can take U.S. workers and dump them and go to China, and it'll be in sync with U.S. foreign policy. Chinese are going to laugh all the way to the bank. Well, here we are today. I mean, if we'd have been conducting this discussion 45 years ago during the Carter regime, maybe 50 years ago at the beginning of the regime, we had a thriving industrial base. We had, tremendous union strength, a middle class that was growing and expanding. Look at what we have today. We've become a sad sack nation, homeless by the millions, people wondering from day to day how they're gonna pay their bills, no retirement pensions for the younger generation. We know what that's going to look like, complete pauperization. So I could go on and on summarizing that. But I think Carter, as a perceptive, intelligent man, I think he realized this was something. He was a Christian. I'm not a Christian, but he was a Christian. And I think he conducted a lot of his work as a means to redeem himself. And I would say that if he had died 40 years ago, I don't think it would have been the same funeral, but maybe he did in that regard. He redeemed his public persona. But again, as I said, facts are stubborn things. The United States today, I think you can say, in many of the disastrous scenarios that we are enmeshed in, trace themselves back to Carter. Even if we don't want to hook the thing around his neck as if he had started this, he magnified 1,000-fold all of these horrible trends that he inherited rather than confront them. So as a young worker, I have no forgiveness. And I also, I didn't mention, but I'll mention that for me, I was already a trade union member and a activist and whatnot. And Carter, or I guess I was still in high school. He thought it was a good idea to revive the draft. So here it had only been a few years since the genocide that we waged in Vietnam had ended ingloriously, and it wasn't very popular. So then they shortened it, not to a revival of the draft, but a revival of registration for the draft. So then this was saddled on us by Democrats and Republicans as if somehow this was needed, as if somehow I was obligated to go along with this because these guys said so. Well, I never registered for the draft. Screw that. My uncle, who had been a combat veteran in Korea, he said, don't put the hook in your mouth if you're not going to go. So I didn't. And, I was visited by the FBI and other folks harassed. My family was harassed. It was all very low key, as many hundreds, if not thousands of others who refused that draft registration. But it was nonsensical. This was just a gratuitous surrender of Carter to the military forces and to the right wing, or to try to appease them somehow. I'll revive draft registration. So you can imagine, as a young man who had, family friends that had gone to Vietnam and an uncle that had been sent to Korea, and this wasn't going to happen for me. So by the time Carter left office, as far as I was concerned, good riddance. But then look at what we had. Ronald Reagan, we were off to the races. Reagan, Bush, and then Carter. It's been downhill ever since. So I wish that I could bring tidings of good news here to everybody. But again, we have to face this. This is how we've ended up where we are today, by not confronting it as far back as Carter.
Right. Well, Chris Townsend, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks very much. And again, everybody should support the Valley Labor Report. There you go. Send them a contribution. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Right. Bye-bye.
All right.
That was awesome. Yeah, I really enjoyed that, Chris, spitting facts.
Oh, you guys I'm off. I can talk.
Oh, yeah. If you had a couple
if you want to keep it going, you're still on
yeah.
with us. But yeah, I just wanted to say that as you were leaving it, I really enjoyed it because I knew you had this planned, and I know you had said something to Jacob a while back. You'd written this piece, and so not to say I was looking forward to it. I wasn't looking forward to anyone's passing, but I knew when I heard the news, we're going to have a good segment from Chris. So
yeah, I'll just reiterate for you guys and everyone. As a working class movement, labor, left, liberal, whatever we think of ourselves as, independent, we must challenge this itch that we have to engage in what I call good news only. It's natural, I suppose. Everybody wants to look for the positive. What's happening here that I might think. Well, look, there are periods in your life, and now might be one of them, where there isn't any good news. And I don't see that as anything that, is dangerous or somehow overwhelming. The question is, what are we going to do to push back? What are we going to do to roll this back? What are we going to do to dig fortifications and get ready? And I'll say, I know this is off the Carter piece, but it's when I saw Joe Biden at the funeral, and I thought, what a pathetic figure. Not pathetic because he's old. I'm going to get old, I hope. Not pathetic because he has to shuffle along. I'll shuffle along when I'm old if I get there. But pathetic because he's done nothing for months to dig fortifications, prepare for the attacks that are already following. He's allowed Trump and his lunatic fringe to essentially govern for the last couple of months. And where's the rest of the Democratic Party? Is there any plan? No, there's nothing that I can discern. So I look at this and I think, okay, well, this is how we end up where we are. This is the sad high price of misleadership, political misleadership. So maybe people have to learn and relearn, and maybe that's part of it. But my experience with Jimmy Carter, I will say it was positive for me in the sense that is really what hardened me as a young worker, as a young man. And it steeled me for a lifetime in the labor movement of struggle and whatnot. And I probably wouldn't have ended up where I am today with all the things that I've done in the labor movement if it hadn't have been for Jimmy Carter, because it did come as a shock to me. I thought, wait a minute, this makes no sense. This is crazy. And I was borne out that it was crazy. And again, later in his life, like everyone else, I would see him doing this and that, and it was hard not to appreciate it. But on the other hand, it was just so bogus as far as I was concerned, because I had never forgotten at least the parts of his governance, his regime, that I actually was well aware of. I would venture to say, if I ever really did the homework, it was probably far worse than even what I thought it was, sadly. But here we are. So I just encourage working people, listeners, to just look for the facts. If they're not what you want to see, you must confront them. To engage in some other sort of thinking is dangerous, and dangerous to your well-being.
Chris Townsend, appreciate your time.
No problem. Thank you.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.